and welcome to Exploring with the Estuarium. My name is Ariel, and I'll be your educator. Today we're going to learn all about tides, the effects that the sun and the moon have on our tides, and how to interpret data from a tide table.
After this lesson, you'll be able to answer questions such as, what causes tides, what is a spring tide, and what is a neap tide? The intertidal zone is an area between the highest high tide and the lowest low tide. At high tide, the beach is mostly covered with water. At low tide, the water retreats and more of the beach is exposed. In most places in the world, there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides each day. A high tide is followed about 6 hours later by a low tide, and then another 6 hours later by another high tide, and finally a second low tide after 6 more hours. Tides are the result of 2 physical forces. One is the gravitational forces of the sun, the moon, and the earth, and the second is the centrifugal force caused by the rotating earth and the moon system. These forces cause the water in the ocean to be pulled into bulges. Both the sun and moon exert a gravitational force on the earth. This force pulls the water in the oceans into a bulge on the sides of the earth closest to the sun and moon. The moon has a larger tidal force than the sun since it is so much closer. While the moon is pulling on one side of the earth, centrifugal force is pulling on the opposite side. If there were no moon, the rotation of the earth would exert centrifugal force equally in all directions. Since the earth and moon are rotating together, the center of the rotation is not at the center of the earth, but is closer to the moon. The gravitational pull of the moon is making the water bulge on one side of the earth, creating a high tide, while the centrifugal force is making a bulge on the other side, another high tide. In between the bulges, there is less water, and therefore creates low tide. The sun is also exerting gravitational force, and because the Earth-Moon system is not only rotating, but also revolving around the sun, there is a second centrifugal force. When there is a new moon, the tide is especially low. Because the sun and moon are both on the same side of the earth, they pull together, causing an extra large bulge. 2 weeks later, the moon will be on the opposite side of the earth and sun, and forces again will be lined up, meaning higher and lower tides. These extreme tides are called spring tides. On the weeks between, the forces of the sun and moon will be pulling in different directions, and will tend to cancel each other out. These are neap tides and aren't nearly as high or low. Based on the position of the sun and moon, which tide is this diagram depicting? A spring tide or a neap tide? It is a spring tide because both the sun and moon are on the same side exerting gravitational forces on the earth, causing the water to bulge on the sides. Based on the position of the sun and moon, which tide is this diagram depicting? A spring tide or a neap tide? A neap tide because the sun and moon are pulling in different directions and will cancel each other out. This is called a moon phase board, and we'll use it to witness the different moon phases from the Earth's perspective to give us a better understanding on how the position of the sun and moon affect our tides. The sun is represented on the right, the center is the Earth, and the moon is placed around the Earth in the different positions it would rotate and is represented by the black and white spheres. In this first position, we're staring at the dark side of the moon, or also called a new moon. The moon is on the same side as the sun, so they're both pulling together, causing a spring tide. Now, as the Earth, we're going to rotate to the next moon phase. In this next moon phase, you can start to see a little bit of a crescent. This phase is called a waxing crescent and is in transition to the neap tide. As the moon is starting to pull away from the sun, there is less gravitational force. This causes intermediate tides. Now we'll continue rotating to the next moon phase. The moon is now on the side of the Earth and has less gravitational pull. This new moon phase is called the first quarter. Because it is on the side of the Earth, it is a neap tide because they're pulling in different directions and cancel each other out. Neap tides aren't nearly as high or as low. As the Earth, we're going to keep rotating. And now we are at our next moon phase. We are starting to see more of the whole moon. This moon phase is called a waxing gibbous. The moon is slowly transitioning to the opposite side of the sun, causing more of spring tides, but not nearly as high. The next phase is called a full moon. It's when we can see the whole moon. This causes our spring tides because the moon is on the opposite side of the sun. They are both poling apart, causing the bulges in the water. As we move away from our full moon, we get to a waning gibbous. This is transitioning to our neap tides because the moon is starting to pull to the side of the earth, and the pull from the sun and the moon are starting to cancel each other out. As we move to our next moon phase, this is called a third quarter moon. The moon is now on the side of the earth, so the forces from the sun and moon are canceling each other out once again and causing a neap tide, so not nearly as high or low tides. As the earth keeps rotating, we move into our next moon phase, and this is called a waning crescent. Now that the moon is becoming closer to the same side as the sun, we're starting to feel more of that pull of the gravitational forces and start transitioning back into our spring tides. From this moon phase, we return back to our new moons, where our moon and our sun are pulling on the same side, causing our spring tides with our extreme high tides and our extreme low tides. Life in the intertidal zone is not easy. Organisms have a lot of adaptations to deal with the changing tides. Some plants can completely dry out at low tide on a sunny day and still survive. Others, like eelgrass, can't dry out and only grow in areas where they can stay wet. Some of the larger animals, like fish, swim out with the tide. Other animals, like clams, barnacles, oysters, and mussels, can close their shells tightly to keep in water. Snails and limpets clamp tightly to rocks, and some animals burrow into the sand and mud, while others hide under rocks. In our area, the highest high tides and lowest low tides occur at night during the winter months, but during the day in the summer months. Gravitational pull is weakest during the first and last quarters of the moon, when there is often little difference between high and low tides. Some places have almost no tides, and so almost no intertidal zone. While other places have very high and very low tides, they have huge intertidal zones. In the Puget Sound, the range of tides between lowest low tide and highest high tide each month is greater here in the South Sound than it is on the open coast. There is roughly a 6-hour difference on any given day between the lowest low tide in the Olympia area and the lowest low tide on the outer coast, like Clayoak, for example. In this student activity, we will use data from a tide table to graph a tide chart to help understand how tides correspond with moon phases. You will need the tides activity worksheet, the tides data table, and graphing paper. This is called the tide table. Look at the data for high and low tide levels on the table. Circle and label the spring tides, the highest high tide, and the lowest low tide. Great, you should have circled the second set of tides on June 1st. Now circle and label the neap tides, the lowest high tide and the highest low tide. Our neap tides were the middle two tides on June 6th. Now we're going to take the data from our tide table and graph the daily high and low tide levels on the sheet of graph paper. You may want to use one color for high tides and another for low tides to avoid any possible confusion. On your graphing paper, we need to lay out the foundation for our graph. On the graph, you need to put a title, a y-axis, an x-axis, and a legend. Fill in the title, and then make the tide level the y-axis and the date of the month the x-axis. Before you begin, carefully consider what graph intervals you will use for each axis so that all the data will fit on one single sheet. Now that our chart is labeled, we need to plot the data points from June 1st, high tide and low tide. Your tide chart should look a little something like this. please use this time to fill in the rest of the chart using the data from your tide table. Great, you just mapped out a tide chart. You can see on June 1st, we had the highest high tides and the lowest low tides. Those are our spring tides. And on June 6th, we had the lowest high tides and the highest low tides, being our neap tide. Now that you understand moon phases and tide tables, you can now choose the best day to go out and visit your intertidal zones.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Exploring with the Estuarium. If you liked our video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you wish to continue to get more of our educational videos, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Facebook at the Puget Sound Estuarium. Bye!